on the headphones if you want to hear the music.
Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/ytaxp and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.
It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show bringing you the queerest, just honestly most divergent out there content. I'm Christy Powell. For those of us who are looking forward to Shannon Q, she sends her apologies, but I am excited to announce that I'm joined again by a Black Widow and OnlyFerb star. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you have to check out Miss O'Kist on social media. Welcome her back. Miss O'Kist, thanks for being here.
Hi, nice to nice for you to have me back again. It's been fun the last few times, and I'm excited for this one too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, tonight we're getting into it. We are introducing the word neuroqueer into your vocabularies in an attempt to better understand neurodiversity and ourselves. So give us a call with your stories and your questions. We're at 512-991-9242 or tiny.cc/callsex because the show is coming right now. All right. Well, that sound means that we are starting this week the same way we do every week, which is with what's turning us on this week. So, Miss O'Kist, super excited to have you back. What's got you turned on this week?
So I just finished watching this one show called Everything's Gonna Be Okay, which is actually a great one for this show today. It's basically a story about this one dude that finds himself like the custodian of the guardian of his younger half sisters, one of whom's autistic, and their life together. And it's kind of a great piece of representation because all the autistic characters are played by autistic actors. And who also had a lot of input on the writing, and it's also super gay and also super asexual, so it's great.
Yeah, all right. So super gay, super neurodivergent, right up our alley tonight. I guess let's go ahead and jump right into the conversation then, because there's a lot to unpack here, and it's a little bit complicated. Like in so many ways, I feel like this is one of the most ambitious episodes that we've done, because even after spending hours researching and getting ready, I think I pitched this idea to you back 2 or 3 months ago, hoping that I would be prepared and I would understand these concepts. And yet here I am on the night of the show, and I'm honestly still kind of struggling with how do you define neuroqueering? Can you help me out at all here?
I can try. It's
Sure.
one of those subjects that is enormously huge, so it's hard to put into succinct terms. And Professor Walker that coined the term, even he says that it's not really a term that you can put an authoritative, succinct definition for, but it's roughly how neurodivergent experiences and identities intersect with other parts of our identities, such as sexuality or gender, because a lot of these things are social, and the way that people with different neuro diversity experience the world is often a little socially offbeat.
Sure. Yeah.
So those things kind of tie in together and make this wonderful double rainbow.
No, that's a good way of putting it. For a lot of folks listening, there are probably a couple of terms that we should hit on really quickly. One of them you've already used here, which is neurodivergent. Can you just very briefly walk us through what that refers to?
Right. So neurodiversity was a term coined by Judy Singer in '98, and it's basically taking like certain things like developmental differences, such as like autism or ADHD or dyslexia, and rather than like categorizing it as a like through the deficit or medical paradigm, seeing it more as like a different expression of like the human genome. So like we have different brains the same way we have different hair, and there's no one right type of brain.
Yeah, we're going to be returning to that idea a lot tonight because I think that's like pretty baked into why the term neuroqueering may be useful. But I guess the other half of it is queer, which is a word that I know makes my dad very uncomfortable, and a lot of people still feel challenged by it. And I want to be respectful to that because I know that that's a term that has been used as a slur. I know a lot of people have had literal rocks thrown at them and have been assaulted while hearing that word attached to the reason for the violence. But I guess for our purposes, queer is just anything that is outside of your cisgendered, hetero, typical, conventionally presenting sexuality. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, and then so I guess heteronormativity is that notion of pressuring people to be what? To be within certain confines?
Right, like the expectation that the default is always heterosexual unless something outside of that signifies. And also like the expectation is going to be that way. Like everyone's brought up with the well, sometimes boys notice girls, and the world is a lot wider.
Mm, fair to say. Well, so neuronormativity may be a new term for some people. We're building off of these same ideas. What can you say about that?
Again, like there's a lot of expectation that all people are going to be neurotypical, which is the what would have been the right brain under the deficit paradigm, and people expect, well, like this things that go with it, like autistic. I'm autistic myself, so have like communication differences that sometimes people misunderstand because they don't understand like the way I communicate, or maybe like I present differently. Like I stem a lot with my hands, and people are not used to seeing that, so that can like make people feel uncomfortable. And there's also often like a lot of pressure to like stamp these differences out of people.
Sure.
So even if you're autistic, you're still supposed to present as neurotypical when you're out in the world. And there's a lot of therapies that
Yeah.
go into making like neurodivergent people seem indistinguishable from their peers.
Fair to say. Well, and then I guess one last term that's going to be useful tonight is intersectionality, because that's really what we're talking about here is the intersection of queer and neurodivergent. I mean, is that fair?
Right, yes. And at least like to me, intersectionality is like no one's just one thing, and we've all got these like different facets to ourselves, and all of these things play into our experiences, and it's how those things all like mesh together to create our unique experiences.
Yeah, so I guess if we take all of that and blend it together, we get something approaching like a functional definition for neuroqueering. I mean, what kind of picture do you get when we think about neuroqueering as a verb, as like the act of neuroqueering? I mean, how do you interpret that?
That to me, I tend to think of first in terms of like activist spaces, people basically trying to disrupt the idea of heteronormity or cisnormity or any other kind of normity, all of them. And sometimes that can be through like advocacy or like teaching people about these different experiences, because hopefully if people understand them, they can empathize with them, and if they empathize with you, they're less likely to demonize you,
Sure.
and everyone is set free. And also like it's often used for like art, performance art, um like literature, any basically if a human can do it, you can neuroqueer it.
Yeah, I like that notion because have been kind of wrestling with my own neurodivergent diagnosis and identity in this past year, and trying to figure out what that means to me. And when we talk about masking and we talk about like neuronormativity and these different concepts, there's a certain sense of like putting on your Sunday best. You know, it reminds me so much of those ideas of like visiting grandma's house and being on your best behavior and going to a nice restaurant and, you know, having to follow the rules and these different things. And so I almost see neuroqueering as maybe the opposite of that. It's like you're still being well behaved, but you're being yourself in like an active and intentional way. I mean, does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, I think so. And I remember when I was on last time, I was talking about like masking as an autistic person, and like be brought up, talking about similar experiences when you get into things like, non-binary identities or trans identities. Like, there's the expectation that people are going to present and be a certain way, and sometimes for safety or self-preservation, um, we kind of put these faces on, and it's like being an actor in your own life rather than living it.
Hmm.
um, and I think that's like one of the most toxic parts of things like neuronormativity and all the other normativities we mentioned is in order to like fly under the radar, you have to kind of contort yourself into an identity that's not your own, which is a very uniquely claustrophobic and lonely existence, really.
Sure.
um, but when you get the moment, like the opportunity to like express yourself as you actually are, and to feel safe to do that, like there's a level of like acceptance and safety that can feel like coming home to a family you didn't know you had. um and I think like it takes a certain amount of bravery to be very, out and obvious. But there's a lot of power in that because there's somebody walking down the street masking some part of their identity, and if they're able to recognize that in you, then maybe they don't feel so alone, and maybe the world doesn't feel as scary and alien all the time. And I think that's kind of one of the most powerful aspects of it, whether it's how you present in public or how you make art or write. Like, there's a lot to be said for representation.
Sure. Well,
That's
and not to mention just the overall stress that is involved when we're talking about masking. You know, I was reading a statistic today that was something along the lines of a suicide rate among autistic folks that's something like 9 times the national average. And that's not because there's anything about autism spectrum disorder or these other forms of neurodiversity that increases the propensity for like suicidal ideations or these kinds of things. It's because of the stress and the pressure and the bullying and the trauma that so often goes along with these identities.
right. I mean, um, like growing up autistic and ADHD, like there's a lot of negative criticism that come at those kids. So like
Sure.
if you go to school, and I can't remember, it was something like it's like a number like 20 times the criticism like most other kids would get. I don't know where that number was got from. But it's true. It's like you're always bombarded with this idea that you're not quite right, or you feel one way, but you're being told that that's not real or
Mm,
possible. And these things can lead to a lot of negative mental health outcomes, such as anxiety and depression. Like, I know that gonna get a bit dark for a second.
sure.
I know that I think I first started experiencing like suicidal ideation in elementary school, so probably around like a little bit around or before the age of 8. um, and that's been, a very common story that I know from a lot of like my trans friends or my other autistic friends. Um, and a lot of it is like there's a template you don't fit, and you're constantly reminded that you don't fit it. But then when you do, if you try to fit it, then nobody knows who you are.
Sure.
So yeah, like it's not a great recipe for good mental health.
So I hate to use the term anti-masking during this bizarre moment in our history, but I mean maybe that's effectively what neuroqueering is like being more thoroughly and fully yourself, leaning into some of these identities, the neurodivergence and the queer identities. Is that maybe a fair way of conceptualizing it?
I would think so. Yeah, like it's kind of like peeling back the layers of that we put on to appear. I don't know. The best word I can think is like is acceptable, and it's one of those things where, like, in some ways, masking is a privilege because some people aren't able to do that. Like non-speaking autistic people, for example, they're gonna really struggle to pass as neurotypical. And there's like downsides on both sides. But also for a lot of people, it's not safe to unmask as a neurodivergent person. Like neurodivergent people are one of the super high statistics for police shootings because
Hmm.
we don't act in a way that is expected and can frighten people. And when you go to police system, that's all about shoot first, ask later. That's doubly compounded when like the person is black and autistic. Like that is a hugely like dangerous intersection of identities and would not be safe to unmask the same way as other people can. Like I'm self-employed as someone who takes their clothes off and makes Furbies for a living, and I'm a tiny white woman, so for me, like I appear less threatening, so I have more scope for unmasking than other people do. And so like I recognize the privilege in it and also the power in it to try and make these things seem less foreign and scary and
Hmm.
hopefully more accepted and recognized by society. Like if people understand what's going on, then they're less frightened of the people, who are doing that, and hopefully would have a less negative response to people who are different to what they're used to seeing around them.
Sure. Well, I'm really entranced by these ideas of intersectionality and how that plays into all of this. When you were here to speak with us about asexuality, and we talked about the ace community and these different things, we acknowledged that there does seem to be a really strong concordance between neurodivergence and asexuality, and probably a handful of other minority sexual orientations. Research is still really catching up with all of that, but I feel like this term sort of like squarely places all of those things together. How what can you say about sort of the, I don't know, the Venn diagram of these different identities and why they so often do seem to come bundled?
I mean, like it's something I think there's been research that has shown that autistic people and neurodivergent people, but I definitely know seen stats for like autistic people. It's something like 2 to 3 times more likely to identify as trans, much more highly likely to identify like as in fact LGBTQ plus in general. And I think like and I think the research also suggests that a lot of it is because like autistic people are less programmed, less I guess like tuned, like hardwired into a lot of these social norms that people kind of just sort of go along with. So are more likely to ask questions like about their gender or about like their sexuality, like less likely to get caught up in what's expected and maybe more likely to start following their own inclinations, whatever they might be.
Yeah, so it might be, at least to a certain extent, the case that folks that are kind of already living in the margins, or who have already
Right.
been sort
Mhm.
of forced to break free of convention, are, are just more prepared to maybe own up, or to acknowledge these identities in a lot of ways.
And I think also maybe more likely to find people that feel like kin. I've
Mm, sure.
noticed a lot of people who are in some way neurodivergent in like the kink communities, for example.
Hmm.
Like like, because it can be a sensory seeking thing or a structure thing. Like, and also it's all these like just freaks and weirdos. And if you're already
Sure.
been identified as a child as being a freaking weirdo, what you go where the other weirdos are. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but there's a reason why when folks come to a new town and they're like, I don't know how to meet up with like the poly community, for instance. I'm always like, just go to a comic book shop. Like, just find some people who are playing Settlers of Catan or D&D, and you'll get an introduction to that community soon enough.
right. It's like after doing like burlesque and pole dancing, I don't know that I have very many neurotypical friends.
Sure.
Because all the people who are like, you know what, I wanna dress up as Shia LaBeouf and take my clothes off. It takes a special kind of person to come up with that. Hey, ginger snaps. And yeah, and that's again, it's like it's where the weird kids are very much accepted, and it's not that strange in their own little context.
Yeah, well, then I guess the answer then is that not everybody can neuroqueer. If we're taking that as a verb, this is then reserved for certain identities, or I don't want to gatekeep, but who does this apply to? Maybe.
Hang on a second. My computer has become unplugged, and I am gonna fix that.
Oh
'Cause it's
goodness.
about
Okay,
to
so
die.
we'll get that sorted out. And yeah, I suppose while we're getting all of that fixed and figured, we can go ahead and touch base with the phones.
Okay, so why is it not charging? Yes.
All right, I'm going to talk to Julie. Julie, super excited to hear from you about these topics. What's on your mind tonight?
Hey, yeah, so I'm sure you recall a few years ago I called in about a similar topic. Yeah, I guess I'm back to talk more about that. I feel that there's this kind of, and just for those who don't know who I am on the autism spectrum myself, and I identify as demisexual. I feel like there's this kind of infantilization of people who like haven't had sex by a certain point, or they're not interested, or they just haven't gotten around to it, or whatever it is. And there's often like this nosiness that kind of is disguised as concern, like or maybe not even intentionally disguised. Like it's like they think they're expressing concern, but it really comes off as just nosiness. And
Sure.
and what I've noticed is what I've noticed, like, I mean, most of my friends and family, it's like, I tell them, they're like, oh, okay, I might as well have told them what I had for lunch, or in my case, didn't have for lunch. And what I found, like, when I was growing up in the 90s, I remember that when I was like 12, 13 years old, 11, 12, 13 years old, I was really uncomfortable with like sex scenes in movies or discussions about sex. And like, if I thought that a movie was going to have like like a sex scene or something in it, I would just avoid it. And I eventually outgrew that when I went to overnight camp, which I'm sure I need not elaborate, because let's be real, half of overnight camp is sex ed. And
I don't know. I went to good
the thing is-
Christian camps, so yeah, okay, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and what I've also found is that there's a lot of girls and women, and I'm talking about cis women here. I really haven't interacted with enough trans women to comment on any kind of like trend, but like I've noticed that a lot of them, like well into adulthood, have the same discomfort. And I can't speak for them, but I can tell you that in my case, I think I know why this discomfort arose. And if you look at a lot of movies, although I mean, well, I think this is starting to change. It was definitely true for movies when I was growing up. It's like if there was a sex scene or discussion about sex in a movie, it wasn't just like, oh, they're having sex. It was portrayed as like a service that a woman was giving to a man, and because
So it's
these
not
movies are
sex
written by
repulsion,
horny.
but misogyny that's been turning you off for a lot of these years. Yeah.
I'm sorry, what?
Well, I was just coming to it. It feels like what you're describing is that at that age, it wasn't that you were sex repulsed or repulsed by the actual sexuality. It was the misogyny that was so bothersome.
Yeah, and I think like if you're not someone who's really thinking about sex, like you're not going to be able to put it in that kind of context. Like, okay, it's just a stupid movie written by horny 50-year-old men for horny 50-year-old men. It's like you're thinking, okay, this is what is expected of me. That it's like this service. And as I got older, I realized, okay, it's just a stupid movie, but I would strongly suspect that could be why so many of us like are or in my case were uncomfortable with it. And my mom unfortunately thought that the answer to this, in the 90s again, would be to tell me what a beautiful thing sex is and how, everybody has these needs eventually. And I guess she thought she told it to me 600 times, and the 601st time I'd be like, oh yeah, okay. And it was a very awkward conversation. But yeah, I'm a month away from my 41st birthday. I haven't pounded anybody. And like last year on my birthday on Facebook, I wrote happy birthday to me. And I posted a poster of the 40-year-old virgin, it was a joke.
Sure.
And it's interesting though. It's like, I know that this is ridiculous, but I almost feel like even by posting that as a joke that I'm revealing like this big secret about myself, which it's ridiculous because I know it's not that uncommon. I know plenty of people, whether it's because the opportunity hasn't come up or they're like me where it's just not a huge thing on their radar. Like it's incredibly common. And unfortunately, one of my friends, I got into a conversation with her about this guy who I know a little bit. I mean, he's like an acquaintance. I don't want to say on the air exactly how I know him. Nice guy, but I was getting the vibe that he had a crush on me. And I said, I'm trying to figure out how to tell him, look, I'm not interested. I see you as an acquaintance. I'll see you at this group. And her answer to that was, couldn't you at least have sex with them? I said, why the hell would I do that? And she said, because then you wouldn't be a virgin anymore. And this isn't the first time we've
it's
had a
some
discussion
problem that needs to be fixed.
Yes, it's exactly that. And I feel like I feel like a lot of people, it's like when some people, when they find this out about me, like they think that, like if there's something going on in my life that's bothering me, they think some people just tend to have this idea like, maybe she was getting laid, it doesn't happen that much, but I have seen it occasionally. And then of course I see people where like I explain to them I'm demisexual and they never heard of it, and I explain it to them, and then they say, oh no, it just means you're saving yourself for the right person. I said, no, that's not what it's about, and fuck you for saying so. I mean, I don't say that to them, but that's what
maybe you do, maybe you should, I don't know.
I reconnected recently with this guy that I went to camp with, and we weren't friends, we're just acquaintances, and like we were talking about how one summer I had this huge crush on one of our counselors at this Israel trip, and he said, yeah, I really didn't understand it because you struck me as asexual, but you were crazy about him. And I said, well, those two aren't mutually exclusive things. It's like if people have no strings attached sex, why can't people like be crazy about somebody, and like at most sex, if it's there at all in their mind, is kind of an afterthought, like rather than the main focus like it is for most people. And he also said, you seem to have you had this real childlike innocence about you. It's like, why? Because I wasn't like hooking up. It's like, I think to myself, would you tell a 15-year-old girl who saw her father jump out of the World Trade Center on 9/11 that she's innocent because she hasn't had sex yet? Like, it's just so messed up. And it also kind of comes with the idea that, like, if you're a girl, sex is something that happens to you rather than, like, something that you do that you have agency in. And
I mean, that idea would repulse me.
Frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
like, these are all
totally.
really important points, and why we're talking about neurodiversity and getting away from that like pathologizing model, the notion that there is something wrong with you for being asexual, for being some sort of queer, for being demisexual, or any of these other labels, because that so often gets bundled up with the notion that there's something wrong with you for having a brain that operates a little bit differently, that has different desires and different interests. Julie, I guess I'm curious, if you've been following the conversation up to this point, how this notion of neuroqueering resonates with you personally.
You know, it is something I have given a lot of thought to, and like I really do wonder if like a lot of us on the spectrum identify with the alphabet club or whatever they call it. If it's more because we're being honest with ourselves, or if it has something to do with neurological or chemical differences. Of course, sometimes people get offended when I ask these questions because they think, oh, you're trying to fix it. It's like, no, I just have a scientific curiosity. Like, one thing I've been wondering about recently is, like, one thing about being demisexual and being on the autism spectrum is that you may not get interested in people that much, but when you do, it's like your brain has been hijacked by neuroterrorists, as I call it. And it's like you're on drugs. I mean, I know a lot of neurotypical people kind of describe it that way, but it's like this times 100. And like what I kind of found myself wondering is, I mean, it's not that the sex in my mind was completely absent. It's like I said, it was, you know, kind of an afterthought, which is kind of part of the definition of demisexual. And I wondered to myself, well, okay, if I'm crazy about so-and-so, or this person or that person, but I'm not like thinking, man, I want to fuck this guy so bad. Like I have to wonder if it's like some kind of chemical difference. Like maybe neurodivergent people use more oxytocin than like the hormones responsible for, I want to bang this guy or whatever. Like it's definitely something worth looking into because I think it's interesting.
I mean, the statistics are pretty stark. I mean, I don't have them all in front of me, and I'll acknowledge that most of the research I've seen, I'm not myself a research scientist or any of these other fields, but most of the research I've seen, while pretty preliminary, seems to show incredibly significant numbers here, that there is so much correlation between neurodivergence and what I'm just going to generally call queerness. Where that's coming from or why is really, really interesting to me. Now, what we do with that information, I think, is really scary. Like, as you're talking about, Julie, like, this is not about fixing people. This is not about unqueering them. This is not about un-autisming them, or however we want to look at that. But it is interesting to be curious about where that connection comes from and what that can tell us about the nature of love and life and sex and everything else.
One other thing that I think is actually kind of eye-rolling is that, like, I have a very raunchy sense of humor, and people are like, well, you know, you have this sense of humor. Are you sure you're not repressing something? And it's like, well, I also make a lot of very gallows humor death jokes. Does that mean I want to go around killing people?
Fair point.
It's oh, sorry.
No, please, Bissell Kiss, jump in here.
There's a couple of things that you'd said, which I picked up on the subject, and one of them was when you ask about, like, I wonder how many of these people are neurodivergent, or if there's some reason for that. And I feel like that's a big kind of part of what we're talking about tonight. Like, I'm autistic and I'm asexual, which is what most people expect from autistic people, and then also don't. But a lot of times, like, oh, don't say that, like it's a bad thing, but it's only a bad thing if you see the other as a bad thing. It's like, if you look at it through like neurodiversity, it's just, you know, being autistic is about as controversial as having brown eyes. Like, it's not inherently negative. And when people treat it like it is that way, you know, they're kind of showing their biases. Sure. And I mean, I also think, like, the whole...
I'm sorry.
Oh, so you go for it.
Yeah, I mean, when I just say to people, it's like, look, if I end up not screwing, no big deal. If I do, I do. If I don't, I don't. It's not really a huge deal to me. And it's like, I might as well be saying, oh, I'm not going to eat for the rest of my life. And it's like, it's not something that's contingent to personal survival. Although this is the part where I'd insert the jokes about how people's junk will shrivel up and disappear if they're not getting any. Like,
that actually came up in one of the, I think, autistic asexual groups I was in. And they were like, oh, like anyone can really go that long without sex. And I'm like, y'all are not going to die for not having sex. Like, it's not like you're in the desert and you're like, I've had water and food, but I haven't had sex. And so I succumb. Like, no one is going to die from not having sex.
Yeah.
Like, it's weird.
Yeah, and of course, people don't seem to forget that there are other, like, if you're desperate, there are other ways of taking care of it, you know?
Sure. Well, and it's worth pointing out that we do live in a culture that justifies and validates a lot of absolutely shitty behavior on the part of people, re men, who haven't had sex recently. So this is definitely a thread that we can follow through huge swaths of our culture that are remarkably problematic.
And I think, like, if someone told me that they were, like, demisexual, asexual, whatever, and a virgin, whenever I hear that, I'm like, fucking A, right on. Like, if you've never been in a situation where you're like, I really want to do the do, and then don't, that's kind of like, congratulations on living and having self-awareness and staying the path that your heart told you to follow. It's like, having sex for the sake of it, if you don't want to, just so you're not a virgin, which is a social construct anyway and not real.
I hate the word virgin. I hate it. It's like the whole mythological freshness seal, and that, like, again, your innocence and just like all this Christian religious bullshit. Like, it's I just want to, like, put my fist through something when I hear that. And by
That's
something,
what pillows are
not
for.
another person.
Well, fair to say. Julie, I really appreciate
when
you giving us your take and just kind of catching us up on some of these things. Before we move on to cover the rest of this material, was there anything else that you wanted to make sure to share with us?
Yeah, just one thing. I just want to say how I first learned the word demisexual. It was very recent. I mean, not very, very recent, but when you think about, like, other terms that have been around for decades, centuries, whatever, this was only demisexual was only coined in 2008, and in 2014, I was at some autism group, and I said, yeah, you know, it's like when I get interested in somebody, it's after I've had like a certain number of conversations with them, and it never has anything to do with appearance. I said, when I meet people, it's just like their appearance is just kind of meaningless to me. And, you know, I have to know something about them before I feel attracted. And they're like, oh, you're demisexual. And I said, what's that? And they said, what you just described. I was like, oh my God, there's a fucking word for this. You know? And I just thought it was an autism thing, but apparently there's a whole word for it.
There's actually, if you want to find it, on neuroclastic.com, and the link is in my slide for that site. At the end, they have an article, at least one, about demisexuality and autism and, like, links between them. So if you wanted to actually, you know, look into any, like, links between the two, and that's something you were interested in, there's a really interesting piece there that, you know, take a look at.
I've got that pulled up. I'll make sure that that's in the show notes for this episode. So anybody who's curious in exploring that link, I'll make sure that we have all of that pulled up.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for calling. I really appreciate you giving us your take on all of this. I do remember you as one of the first folks that we ever got to talk to on this show. So thank you for staying in touch.
No problem. It's a great show. And I'm glad that you guys realize that being sex positive means not just being like, oh, let's have a sex tet while we're bungee jumping. It's like, you know, it's like freedom of religion is also freedom from religion, or whatever, you know?
Yeah, well, glad to hear it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we have a number of other great calls on the line, but before we get to that, I really want to get a little bit further into this conversation. First, though, let's take a look at what's going on around the rest of the ACA.
And he goes on to say things like they're having drag queens come in and read to children.
Man, I wish that drag queens were getting invited to read to kids in schools.
There was one guy that said a female Bigfoot drug him up from the creek and had intercourse with him. And of course, my question is, how was it?
Please, this isn't Thursday.
Dave Chappelle did a bit talking about how after 9/11, he turned on the news and there was a reporter that was like, we're going to go right now to talk to Ja Rule about his thoughts on this tragedy. And Chappelle's like, no one gives a what Ja Rule thinks at a time like this.
This tin of beans is the almighty deity, and we need to worship this tin of beans because it will bring us prosperity and it will make us all fertile.
I do not care what your religion is. I do not care if you believe in a God. I do not care if you like green eggs and f***ing ham.
Dynamite. Absolute dynamite. All right. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's actually go ahead and jump into the calls and talk to Dylan in Florida. Dylan, you had some curiosity about neurodivergence and gender. What's on your mind tonight?
Yeah, hello. I just got off work and I'm right by a train track. So if a train goes by, I'll try to mute it.
Well, fair enough. Tell us what's on your mind.
But I was kind of curious to know if you've ever really heard of like audi-gender and that sort of thing, and how autism and possibly even ADHD can kind of affect your perception of gender. Because I've kind of sort of read about it, and I kind of was like, oh, that kind of, it's not like similar, but it kind of would make sense for a lot of my perceptions of gender, because it doesn't, I don't know, gender's just so weird to me.
It really is. Miss O'Kiss, before I butcher it, can you walk the audience through something of a definition of audi-gender?
Yeah. It's basically it's not that like autism is a gender, but that like because like gender is mostly about like social performance, or like a social construct type thing. Being autistic sometimes makes gives us a complicated relationship with our gender. So like, I mean, it's actually one I feel very, very firmly attached to there too, because it's not as clear cut. And being autistic makes it a lot wigglier, I suppose, for want of a better word. Like, I mean, some people are very attached to a specific gender and feel very strongly about it, and some people like myself, I don't really
Sure.
understand a lot of it, because a lot does seem to be performance aspecty, and sometimes people can feel quite strongly one way but present very differently another way, because it all gets mixed up. So it's kind of how, as an autistic person, you experience the concept of gender, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Dylan, does that line up with what you're referring to here?
Yeah, it's kind of, because with me, I've felt decently comfy with being referred to as demi boy, because I kind of like the non-binary with just a little splash of math. But because but certain things, like, I really love just, I guess, the vibe of butchness, and maybe it's just the masculinity of it, but just like butch lesbians, just their vibe has just always been immaculate to me. And I'm like, oh, I kind of want that. And I'm like, oh wait, I'm AFAB, right? I could be that. And I'm like, but like a skinny boy. I'm like, I don't know. It's just always like certain things just make it feel weird, because I'm just like, I don't know. Gender's weird. Could you be both at the same time? Could you do,
Yeah, I mean, it's all made up, which doesn't mean it isn't important. You know,
Right.
like money is made up. Like the United States of America is a made up concept. Like we all just sort of agreed that that was a thing. And gender falls into that same category. And so it can feel really squishy while also being really rigid at the same time. And I very much relate to that sense of, well, we can just kind of do anything, but it can also get really nihilistic. Like I can appreciate that sense of, well, why are we even having these conversations? Like, why don't we just do away with gender? And Dylan, I maybe even started to hear that in your voice until you come out and say, but no, 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 there are these pieces of it that are so me, that they are these like little cut and copied, like things I want to pull from the buffet that really matter to me. I mean, is that a fair way of describing this for you?
Yeah, because actually I'm kind of it's kind of funny because if I do go to a buffet, it's maybe I'm not diagnosed autistic, but I'm like 95% sure I do have it. I am diagnosed with ADHD, but when it comes to food and topics of food and bits and pieces, that's honestly how I eat my food. Is make sure it doesn't touch, but it's still all there on the plate. Try to make it fit, if that makes sense.
It really does.
Well, I appreciate you bringing, yet another confusing autism related gender word into the equation. And I guess, I'll take a quick aside to just thank the audience for being curious and for being interested and eager to make space for folks who have been marginalized so much. And I recognize how kind of confusing and sometimes even like what's the point on some of these topics, but these are also deeply, deeply human issues, and I think incredibly worthy of our time and attention. And so, Dylan, I really appreciate you raising some of these ideas. Was there anything else that you were maybe curious about that Miss O'Kiss might be able to walk you through, or anything else you wanted to say tonight?
I'm not too sure. I'm just really thankful that I got a call tonight because I was contemplating if I could try and call the transatlantic show, but I got off early tonight. So calling in tonight was really, really nice. Just sort of just going through life, most likely having autism and trying to figure things out, and just even one facet of gender possibly being figured out. Because life is so confusing.
Yeah, Jesus, do I relate to a lot of that. So thank you so much for bringing all this up. We're so glad that we got to talk to you, and hope to hear from you again.
Also, I want to add, like, self-diagnosis is super accepted in the autistic community. So, if you wanted to participate more in those spaces and we're unsure, because not having a formal diagnosis, like, you 100% welcome, and it can be a really good way to learn more about, you know, what it's like to be autistic, and maybe, take that 95% sure to like a 99.9% sure, which is about as much as I'm even able to get to.
Fair to say.
But yeah, because it's really hard to access diagnosis as an adult.
Hmm.
And especially, anyone who's not a cis white dude. Basically, it's hard.
Yeah,
All right.
the main thing that kind of pointed me in that direction was reading like lesser known symptoms, and one of them was feeling almost like an alien, and I kind of just started snot crying because I'm like, oh, so that's not really oh, and, all sorts of things, but that was like the one thing that got me, is kind of feeling like you kind of got dropped in a world that's very similar to yours but just off.
It's actually a really great piece, and I forget, I am a terrible human being. I am forgetting the author's name, but it's called like Don't Mourn Us, and it kind of explores the alien dropped off, like Superman style, with like a family on Earth. Because I felt that way. I was the alien ever since middle school. So if you like look up like autism and don't
Yeah,
want it, then
it's
I'll
from the
find it.
Autism Network International, by Jim Sinclair. I'll make sure to have a link to that in the show notes as well.
I love that piece.
All right. Well, Dylan, thank you so much. You have a great night.
You too.
Well, we are kind of circling around this question for a while now, but let me pose it to you directly again. Can anyone neuroqueer? Is this reserved for people with certain identities? And where do we get those identities? Like, who does this word apply to?
It's a tough question. And I don't know that I have an answer because, of course, neurodiversity covers everybody. But it's like if we look at taking off masks that neurodivergent people wear, would to say anyone can neuroqueer open it up to people trying on marginalized identities that maybe went their own, which would be uncomfortable, but at the same time, I don't know, because it's like normalizing neurodivergent presentation is a goal, and the
Looks like we're having some connectivity problems. We will work to get Miss O'Kist back on the line. In the meantime, I suppose let's talk to Rod in Georgia. Rod, you had some curiosities about the labels that we use. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I was just curious to just get you guys' opinion or view on just, do you feel like labels are important in general? Do you feel like they're important? Do you feel like do they provide structure for society?
Yeah. No, I think that's an incredibly valid question. And it's one that doesn't have a straightforward answer. Honestly, the next line of questioning that I had for Miss O'Kist was in reference to whether or not this idea of neurodivergence is a useful label and what we can be doing with it as a society. But more generally speaking, I have to say that myself and most queer folks I know, honestly, are kind of two minds about this. Like, yes, these labels matter. And I'm just going to say that concretely. There are too many people that have bled and died for these adjectives. There are too many people who have suffered in order to be able to attach themselves to some of these labels. And so I'm absolutely going to say that, yes, they matter. They provide personal understanding. They provide community. They provide connection to resources and to other information. There is a lot of value in these labels. At the same time, I do want to acknowledge that people are just people, that whatever language we tend to drag our culture through, that individuals are individuals and need to be seen that way. And we can get a little bit too mixed up in trying to find all the right adjectives and trying to obsess over, well, am I a queer demi-boy, autogender? Like we can get into all of these things and they can start to drive us crazy. At the same time, they can connect us with people. And so if you are finding some balance in all of that, it's one of the reasons why when people ask me about my sexuality, if I'm talking to somebody that I'm on my 5th date with, I might throw out a bunch of labels and a bunch of adjectives, and I might tell some personal stories, and I might really get detailed with it. But generally, when people ask me about my gender, about my sexuality, I tend to just say queer, because I don't necessarily need to give everybody this detailed definition of who I am. I know it's a bit of a long-winded answer, Rod, but how does that all resonate for you?
Yeah, I just feel like it's a rabbit hole that we go down, and I don't see it ever really ending. There's no end point in it. I mean, we could dice a label down and then dice those labels that come from that label down. It could be a huge progression of labels to where each label is unique to each individual person, because we all are different. Like you said, we all are individuals. And so I just want to, I'm just trying to figure out, I know it's an arbitrary line, but I feel like as a society, we do need to have maybe, like, obviously, like, we define, like, the color red as this particular piece of the electromagnetic spectrum as red, and we define it, we label it as red. And so that's what we all can communicate, because we all understand that frequency to be red. And so, I mean, to think about it with gender and things of that nature, like, where do we draw the line and say, okay, this is, this is that, or this is this particular label. And it's like we are, I don't know, majoring in the minors, so to speak, when we go down these, like, long rabbit holes of extended labels on top of labels. I just thought about that. That's
Yeah, no, and you're not wrong, and I totally get that. The cutoff point is arbitrary, and it can be unnecessary. At the same time, I think that you have to acknowledge that that's not just a gender issue or a sexuality issue. I mean, that could be true of really anything. If I say I am a sci-fi fan and somebody starts to talk to me about Star Wars, and then I say, well, no, I'm actually a Star Trek fan. And then they start to talk to me about, Star Trek Discovery or something. I'm like, no, I'm a 1990s Star Trek fan. And then they start to talk to me about the Next Generation. But no, I'm a Deep Space Nine. So there might be some value in just starting out by saying, no, I like Deep Space Nine. That's the Star Trek for me. So, it can be useful for finding community and for connecting people in these ways, and for, finding the right website for all of your Star Trek Deep Space Nine gear. But the truth is, where we draw that line, how we draw that line, and when we draw that line is a personal choice and a complicated one. So I empathize with some of your concerns here, Rod, because I know that a lot of people, myself included, have lost unnecessary sleep, driving themselves crazy, trying to find the exact right adjectives. And that's a destructive process. At the same time, these labels really do have a lot of power and a lot of meaning.
right. I agree with both sides. I do think that it does give a little bit, it's a positive side to it, but I feel like it causes a lot of confusion. Also on one end, you know what I mean? So, if I like you said, if I'm a sci-fi fan, I'm a sci-fi fan. I mean, we could discuss on an individual, on a personal level, what specific, I like about it, sci-fi. But I think as a whole, because there's this broader term of sci-fi, I guess, and that would be like saying queer, I guess. I don't know. It's very subjective.
Sure. Well, I mean, may I ask, are there any particular lines that you draw that you are perhaps challenged by? Because I think that another piece of this can be standing sort of outside of other people's labels and not necessarily understanding the significance or the importance of those things from the inside. What are some of your own experiences with, like, how these lines work and where to draw them?
Well, like I was a biology major in school, and I'm not really. I know that gender is like a social construct, and I do feel like gender, though, is somewhat tied to our sex, and that those labels that we have that were created, that are socially designed and socially constructed, were, I guess, derived from our our sex. That's me having XY chromosomes, someone having XX chromosomes. I think there is.
Yeah, but we recognize that is not a really accurate or complex understanding of how gender or sexuality works. Like, that notion of XX and XY is perfectly fine for teaching, like high school science class. But that's not the line that we use for actually dividing folks up when we're looking at genetics with any level of sophistication or complexity. The notion that we could simplify life by not having all of these adjectives, by just taking a test and separating people out into XX and XY, is complete nonsense to any scientific mind. And I've got more than enough data and research on that topic on my website. I can make sure to put that in the show notes to this episode as well.
Right, but that's what biology does, though. That's what biology does. Biology says.
No, it doesn't, Brad. I'm going to interrupt you here because I feel like this is a really common, really inaccurate talking point. I want to be super, super clear on this point.
Can I finish?
Genetics are not as simple as XX and XY. There's much, 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 much more sophistication that goes into defining our biological, if you want to call it that, sex. There are so many different hormones. There are so many different genes. There are so many different complexities to all of this that I want to make sure that we include in this conversation a deep understanding of the fact that there is absolutely no way that you can divide our population into XX and XY. And if you're not familiar with that research or not familiar with these concepts, no flies on you. I understand it's a common idea in our culture. Like I said, I will have that information in a link that you can find in the show notes to this episode. I'd encourage everybody who is maybe on the fence or like eager to disagree with me to look at the data. I am not a research scientist. This is not my field. I am not a biologist by training, but the data is overwhelming and it's worth taking a moment to look at.
I just wanted to ask a question. You keep interrupting me. I just wanted to ask one question.
Sure, I apologize. Please do.
Through the process of meiosis, the population is generally speaking 50-50. Haploid cells, right, which are sexual cells, come from diploid cells, and they are split up during meiosis. During anaphase 2, you separate sister chromatids and you separate homologous chromosomes. They end up you get haploid cells from that, and so you are creating X and you literally separate X and Y, and that's why you have a female can be XX and then a male can be XY. Now, if there's an issue with meiosis, then you have like during non-disjunction. You may have where someone may have two X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, like Klinefelter syndrome, or they may not have.
There are some exceptions to that, like you're saying, when we're talking about intersex individuals and some of these different genetic complications. But I can only say so many times that it's more sophisticated than the way that you're describing it. This notion of XX and XY, you cannot look under a microscope and go, oh, that's an X chromosome. Oh, that's a Y chromosome in 100% of cases. Yes, that is just not an option. This is not the type of show where I'm able to like pull out all of the data and like run through that with you. That's really not my training either, but it's just simple scientific fact. And I have that information neatly clumped together in a article that I will make sure is listed in the show notes to this episode. If you'd like to take a look at it and give us a call back next week, send me an email, whatever else, please do. But for now, I want to welcome Miss O'Kist back to the air. And otherwise, I would encourage you to take a look at that information and get back to us soon. All right. Well, thank you, Rod. You have a great night. I hope to get to talk to you again about these topics. Miss O'Kist, we are so glad to have you back. Sorry you've been dealing with the gremlins all night.
It turns out my laptop had been charging on a broken charger all day, and the replacement one I got was feeble. It was not working. So I'm back. I'm sorry about that.
Fantastic.
And for using the F word.
Oh, yeah. No, fuck. Please do. But I was asking you about something that I actually got to talk to Rod a little bit about, which is I suppose the value of these labels. You know, V and I used to have these kind of playful arguments about whether or not it was useful to just have more and more and more specific identities. And I guess I'm curious whether or not you feel like the word neuroqueering really adds much to our culture, to our understanding of science, or to the world at large?
Yeah, I think it probably does, because trying to figure out your identity, whether it is, your sexual orientation or gender or romantic orientation, is incredibly complicated, and it becomes more complicated if you're like neurodivergent, especially if it's in a way that affects certain like the way you interact with certain social constructs. And I think like words help us frame thoughts. I mean, there's like the whole Wolffian hypothesis where words enable thoughts, the chicken, the egg, who knows. But
Sure. Yeah.
I think when you put a word around something, it makes it easier to frame it and also almost validate it. Especially like, say, if you're part of a minority of like a marginalized population, such as autistic people, where our experiences go largely questioned and invalidated at every turn. When there's a word around like something that you experience, it helps people maybe accept it and understand it better. And I think also it makes it more tangible, because sometimes like it's very easy to be walking around feeling a certain way and feeling like everyone else has this figured out or that figured out, and there's a difference for you and it feels like a personal failing or a deficit. So I think when you have like a word like neuroqueer, it signals that you're not alone in your experience, that there are other people who experience it too. And it also, lends itself to people looking into it and trying to understand it more. So I think like when you have a term like that, it helps kind of bring you into a collective. And it's also an action. Like it's like we've already said, like it's a verb. Like there is, activism that can be done under the banner of neuroqueering. Like it's an active word that begs for active participation. So
Sure.
in that sense, it has a very practical and actionable element, which to me
Which feels
makes it
validating to
yeah.
me. Like there's something about being able to say, "Oh, I'm not," not that a autistic identity or any of these other things that we're talking about are a carte blanche to just behave in any way that you choose to behave. But there is something to be said about having a terminology for, look, I'm not being obnoxious. I'm not being an asshole. I'm not looking to be a distraction. I'm not trying to make this about myself or whatever else, but instead being able to say, like, I'm neuroqueering. Like, I am choosing to express myself in a way that is perhaps not unconcerned, but that it's not like beholden to other people's level of comfort.
Right. And it's again like it makes a space for these things to happen, and it also makes a space to talk about and explain experiences that might seem, what's the word, wibbly to others. Like I have a lot of parts of my identity that would come very firmly under wibbly, like romantic orientation, for example. A lot, I've always like tried to like, what is romantic attraction? And the answers you get will be very socially defined. It's like, well, like dates and rose petals. And I'm like, well, I don't do any of that. Like, I don't act in these quote unquote, like typically romantic ways. So am I aromantic? And I don't know where it all fits. And with like neuroqueer, it kind of captures these things where it's like you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes, like we're wired in a way that maybe we're just not going to figure that out so well. So it gives shape to something that has no shape. And also, like you said, like behaviors and art and performance, like it gives visibility to things that maybe don't have a lot of visibility or acceptance. Like I was out doing something and not having the best of times. So there was some like hardcore stimming happening. And it was going to buy algae shots. And there's like a pediatrician office there. And there was like some kid looked actively delighted. And, like if you're this like autistic kid who's been told, quiet hands and active listening and everything else, like if you see adults out there doing these things, like you're not a baby for doing whatever, like it helps validate that you're not alone and you're not defective. Like it is a fair and valid form of expression and being. And I think like people need to get more aware of that. Like one of the things I spend a lot of time, if anyone is like friends with me on Facebook, is bitching about memes. Bitching about memes has been my pandemic hobby, because like I keep seeing these things and we're like, blah, 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 blah. That's toxic behavior and that's a red flag. And I'm like, that's neurodivergent behavior and you're totally miscategorizing it. Like in some situations, maybe it is a red flag. But assuming neurotypical intent behind every action is problematic, because you are defining neurodivergent people as, being toxic for being themselves. And, that's how you get these like, alien and sinister readings of neurodivergent people. So yeah, I spent a lot of time going through these like, like really, I want to say like pop psychology memes that will come up.
Sure.
Like, let's normalize not interrupting a story with a story about yourself. And I'm like, well, that's how a lot of neurodivergent people show empathy and connect to your story.
I remember you posting something to that end, and I am pretty sure that I like cut and copied it and sent it to my partner, because I mean, honestly, we're talking about self-diagnosis and these different things. Just following you on social media is a masterclass in like better understanding yourself in these kinds of topics, because there is real value in having some language around all of this, being able to say like, yes, maybe this is me, but it's not just me, and there are adjectives that we can use to describe it. There are other people who experience it,
and I think like showing the other side shows that maybe other people's views of the world aren't the only views of the world, and their understanding of what people are doing isn't always what people are doing. And hopefully we can get to a place where things are more open to everyone. Like when I think of like neuroqueering and things like that, I think of accessibility. Like Hannah Gadsby had this thing in Douglas where she was talking about the first time she went to Pride, and it was all very loud and she wanted to know where the quiet gays are. And I was like, where are the quiet people?
Where are the quiet gays? Yeah.
But the thing is, like, sometimes these spaces are so like overstimulating and inaccessible to people with different like processing disorders, for example, or like autism. And there needs to be space for autistic gays. You need to be able to be gay and autistic and participate without being massively overloaded. And I think that's one of the things where things come together a lot. Like trying to find your people is challenging when you're neurodivergent. Trying to find your people when you're of like a sexual minority is challenging. And then when you put them together, wow. Because like there's all these like sort of subtle signals. It's like if someone's like, are they gay or not? Like I've got friends who are like super duper femme and no one thinks they're lesbian ever. Because they don't look lesbian enough or act lesbian enough, or whatever. So it's like really difficult. And I think like neuroqueer especially helps the double rainbow find each other, like if people can understand more. And definitely like people need to really really like break out and understand more, because some of the meanings I've seen attributed to otherwise neurodivergent behavior, which is completely inaccurate, is just wild to me.
Sure.
And I think like, activism in that space is kind of awesome and powerful, and how we get to a place where people can just be.
Yeah, at least on a certain level. I mean, just energetically, I mean, my reaction when I see this term out and about, and I see people using it, there's a transgressiveness about it that is to me so validating to get away from this pathology paradigm and to increase like acceptance and visibility of neurodivergence, and just to encourage people to remember that there's no right way to be, that
Right.
there's no wrong way to be. And when we're talking about people being themselves, being their neurodivergent selves, that's actually a beautiful piece of diversity rather than a problem to be stamped out or a disease to be cured.
And the thing is, you can't cure it. I know there's a lot of people out there who are going to be very upset at that. Mostly the autism moms and parents who are very into the idea of a cure. But the thing is, like, the brain you got, the brain you got.
Sure.
Like, if you pop out into the world with an autistic brain, you will eventually pop out of it with one. Like, it doesn't, you can't change your brain. And you know, like, people need to accept that, because all you can really do is make people better at masking, but it doesn't make them not autistic. It just makes them work harder to try and be something else. And
To try and cover up pieces of themselves.
right.
Yeah.
And it is acting. Like, I mean, I've done it for years. And still find myself doing it sometimes too. But like, it is acting, and it's, you know, it's exhausting, and it leads to really poor outcomes for people. Like, imagine if you spend all of your energy you do doing your job just acting like you're looking like you're doing your job, and then you have to do your job. Like, on top of it, like, yeah, you burn out fast. And I think, like, the more people can embrace, you know, the people as they are, the lot less time everyone has to spend pretending there's something they're not and acting this role that just isn't them. And I think, like, it probably benefits everyone. Like, I shared a piece about teaching, and this person is talking about how if they were to you know, like, teach all children as if they were neurodivergent, neurotypical students would do well too, because they'd also get chance to, like, learn to regulate themselves and advocate for themselves. Like, there's literally no losers there. And I think, like, if we just, you know, believe people when they say what, you know, they're feeling, what they're experiencing, and maybe treat people like these things are real and possible, and respect them how they are, there's really no losers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that brings to me to what is perhaps the most important question of tonight, which is recognizing that, you know, this can be a seemingly like very niche topic. And I really appreciate the audience sticking with us tonight, even if a lot of these adjectives and labels don't really seem to apply to you. Ultimately, though, what can anybody watching this use this information to make a better life for themselves, or a better world for all of us? What advocacy, what directions, what would you encourage people to be doing or thinking based on this conversation?
I mean, one of the things I would ask people to do is to question the expectations they have. Like, maybe people have already started to do that. As you know, we've had more conversations around, like, trans rights recently. So people who otherwise hadn't been, I guess, exposed to these ideas are now getting exposed to these ideas and learning more. And I think, like, keeping your mind open to possibilities, and maybe being less sure that everything you know about all people, you don't. Like, there's no universal along the way. And I mean, I highly recommend, like, following, like, neuroqueer is a hashtag, and you can see people posting about their lived experiences with it, but also, like, their art and you know, art, literature, performance art, and you get to see and explore, like, these ideas. Because even if you're, you know, neurotypical and heterosexual, you can only improve your life by learning more about the lived experience of others. Like, everyone's always talking about how autistic people apparently have no empathy. we do, but maybe expand your empathy too. Like this, like Milton talks about the double empathy problem. Like autistic people understand autistic people, neurotypical people understand neurotypical people, and then we all get confused when we meet in the middle. But maybe take the time to look and learn more about how people experience things and present things. Make your events more inclusive. Like a few years ago, before COVID, at London Pride, there was Ace Space, which was like an Ace club that they did, and one of the the considerations was like a quiet space, because any autistic people coming are going to need somewhere to be. Like, make your have accommodations and considerations so people who are neurodivergent can participate in like the other half of their double rainbow. And learn a little bit about different people and appreciate their art, because it comes from a different place, and maybe you'll see things in a light that you haven't seen before. And go check out some like neurodivergent artists and writers. Like, there are so many amazing wordsmiths out there, and like open yourself up to a content and ideas that are maybe different to what you're used to. And don't share memes that share any
that have
human
shitty
trait
notions
as a
behind 'em.
universal thing.
Yeah.
Because there's no universal anything.
Yeah, well said. I know that we have already talked about a dozen different articles that I'm going to, make sure are in the show notes to this episode. Are there other resources that you might recommend for people who are wanting to do that work?
My gosh, that's a good question. I mean, hashtags are always a good one on social media, because people are getting more and more, lively, for want of a better word. That's the best word that my brain came up with right now. There. So like, look up neuroqueer, look up neuroqueer art if you're an artist. Find these voices. I like neuroclastic.com. It's in my slide at the end. That's a really great site. They have a really good article on neuroqueer over there. Also, like even on the forums, we have a new neurodivergent like forum, like subforum. So if you have questions around that, you think you might be, even if you're not on the A spectrum, it's actually anyone can talk there. You can go ask questions there, find out things there, and like engage with the community. Like, even if you're not autistic yourself, the autistic community we love talking to people and having people learn more, like find out what's important to these different communities. It's really easy now. Like, I am a child of the 80s. I remember where finding shows involved finding the one cool record shop and then digging through all the flyers to fly the flyer, and then like follow a treasure hunt to like some really shitty pub somewhere. Like, it's kind of easy now. If you type a word in and you put a hashtag in front of it, you can find so much stuff. And support it. If you see it, support it. Like, and if people are sharing things that you now know are questionable, like challenge them or question them. And the biggest one I can ask for, this is like at least for an autistic person, please back up autistic people on social media. Because the amount of times autistic people will say something, then get dogpiled and like shut up is phenomenal. So if you like back people up. Because sometimes people will listen to the neurotypicals or whatever, because y'all communicate in a way that's not apparently super rude or abrupt or whatever.
Yeah, we'll definitely get a number of those links up here in just a moment. In the meantime, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave with the audience tonight? Oh, looks like we may be having some trouble with Miss O'Kiss connection. All right, well, we'll hopefully get that sorted. But if you're here, I just wanted to take a moment and see if you had any final words you wanted to leave with the audience tonight.
It's a hard one. I guess like learning about yourself is a lifelong journey. Like, you will probably be finding things out about yourself by the time you're 80. Like, there's no rush to have all the answers. There's no rush to have it all figured out. Like, celebrate yourself the way you are. And if you've been like masking or covering up some part of your identity for a long time, it might be hard to uncover where you stand on things. Like, a lot of us, neurodivergent, queer, any combination of the two, have spent a lot of time hiding parts of ourselves. Like, try and explore and find out more about what makes you tick if you think you've been doing that. And yeah, celebrate the differences.
Celebrate the differences. Yeah, I think that's what it all comes down to. Well, I'm going to let the booth pull up some of your links, but where can people find you around the web and learn more about some of these ideas?
There, actually. Like, Instagram is a place where I'm fairly prolific. My Facebook, a lot of it is friends only, but if you message me with a, hey, I saw you on Secular Sexuality, I'll know that you're not, some weirdo who's just going to share Trump memes, and I will add you.
Honestly, one of my favorite follows, sincerely.
Thank you. I will keep on bitching about memes and writing long screeds about things that most people wouldn't normally care about. And at some point, I keep meaning to maybe get a YouTube channel, but I'm old and it's technology.
Fair to say. Fair to say. Yeah. Well, I have a incredible crew here that makes it look like I understand how to use YouTube.
They're so
I, in
great.
fact, do not. Yeah, they're remarkable. Oh, we'll go ahead and pull up that image. Thank you all so much for making all of this work. Oh, and Katie's got the Secular Sexuality shirt. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I should tell people quickly that you can find that wonderful shirt at tiny.cc/merchaca. You can, of course, find all of the Atheist Experience Network podcasts at tiny.cc/AEN podcasts. And you can see Miss O'Kiss and a number of great memes and a bunch of my stupid thoughts and ideas in the Secular Sexuality Facebook fan group, which I would invite people to check out. And if you are watching this live, you can also find us immediately after the show at tiny.cc/ACD Discord, the incredible atheist community of Discord, where we will be hanging out tonight. But with all of that being said, Miss O'Kiss, thank you so much for helping walk us through this like very kind of confusing and big and empowering and intimidating and scary and exciting material. Always a great time when you're here. Thank you so much for everybody who made some space tonight to I guess make some room and better understand a hugely marginalized part of our society. I hope that you feel empowered now to be a better version of yourself or to work to help create a better world for folks that these labels apply to. But regardless, wherever you find yourself tonight, I hope that you'll take a nice quiet moment for yourself and give yourself a big old orgasm. Or, better yet, give somebody else one.
Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.